thank you all for coming out. I'm Scott. I'm your moderator for the evening. I am super excited to be here about the topic specifically. I've spent a lot of my career in venture consulting and startups and now in banking, working with really, really early stage companies, often coming out of academic labs and closely working with universities and things like that. So this topic is near and dear to me. There's a great slate of panelists here that are going to tell you all of their experiences, insights, etc. And hopefully everyone in this room goes away with something valuable in terms of what the journey is like, what you can expect, and how to navigate the great lab exit, as we're calling it. So I think the best place to start would just be giving everyone up here, all of our panelists, a chance to introduce themselves briefly. I know that you've all gone through Nucleate. You can mention when you went through Nucleate, but also what companies you're working for and what you're building.
Yeah, of course. Hello. My name is Aykut Aksit. I'm a mechanical engineer. I did my PhD at Columbia, spun out Haystack about 2.5 years ago, and went through Nucleate, I think, about a year ago, maybe. Don't really remember. Everything's a blur. We work on Haystack Medical, that is creating the first precise, safe tools for accessing this really difficult to access space in the body, the inner ear, for hearing loss and balance disorders. We've been working on this project for about 10 years, which is why we needed the help of Nucleate and many others to actually translate it out.
Yeah, thank you, Nucleate, for having me. It's always a pleasure to get to talk at Nucleate events. We love New York. It's been our home base since 2022. We went through Nucleate 22 to 23, and then it's a direct spin out from my lab, for my graduate thesis work. And our company is now called Nephrogen. We're working on gene therapy for kidney, which is also a difficult place to access for a number of reasons, and trying to bring potentially curative gene therapies to market as soon as we can.
Yeah, John Scheiman, co-founder and CEO of FitBiomics. I got my PhD in biomedicine from NYU, then did my postdoc in George Church's lab at Harvard Medical. We're doing something a little different. We're actually translating the microbiome of elite athletes and then turning that into novel probiotic microbes that could help with health and longevity applications. So less therapeutic, more sort of consumer preventative. We were in the Nucleate 2025 cohort. Yeah, it's been a great program and excited to be here.
So thank you for the intros. As you all can see, we have a variety of folks here with really interesting and exciting experiences. So I'm excited to dive in. Where I want to start and pose the first question is with the moment, the inflection point, right? In my experience working with founders that have spun out of institutions, you at some point during the journey realize that you have something that can be a company that's not just interesting science or not just publishable. So I'd love to just start and hear about those moments for each of you, if you can remember them and think about them.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, being in George's lab, I think we're always very big on translation and entrepreneurship. So I think sort of the moment for us was, when we dug into the science and metagenomic information, we actually identified microbes that were uniquely enriched in these super rare phenotypes. We were able to isolate them and get sort of preclinical validation, publish that in Nature Medicine. And sort of in parallel, I think this is very important, rather than doing science for science sake, we're able to do a lot of market research and sort of let's say, probiotic markets, longevity markets, and sort of map out and de-risk that whole translational commercialization pipeline. So I think when we validated our hypothesis, published the papers or clinical validation, and then married that with commercial demand, I think we knew we had something that was ready to spin out.
For us, it happened very slowly, and also I'm from a lab that had never produced a startup before, so it's definitely more difficult when nobody knows what they're doing. But for me, I remember a set of experiments that we'd done, and I remember feeling after that I had been entrepreneurial, but for the first time I had this feeling of inevitability that this would make it and be huge. And yeah, I've never let go of that feeling.
Yeah, I think for me it's a little different because I knew that I wanted to make it therapeutic. And so there just becomes a point in that journey where like you have to make a company. You can either license it, so that's what we actually tried to do. Like Stanford's Office of Technology Transfer was basically contacting VCs, and they have a process for spinning things out. And I think what I realized is like my co-founder, who was my mentor, my graduate thesis mentor, he basically told me like, we need somebody to run the company and do the pitches and like actually make it real. And like I was actually planning to go be a medical student at that point, as a long story, but I wasn't planning to stay and run the company. But I think for me it was sort of, there was no other way that the technology was going to be seen forward. And I think for me, I realized that's what I wanted to do, is see it forward. So it made sense, and it was like supposed to be a temporary thing, and now it's 4 years later, and I'm definitely happy with the decision. So
Yeah, there's something to be said about kind of going into it knowing that that's what you're aiming for versus having that aha moment along the way. Both very viable paths towards where you all are today. Demetri, you started to kind of talk about this, and where I was going to go next was sort of asking about something that a lot of academic folks aren't thinking about when they first think about starting a company, is the role that they want to play or the role that they should play, right? And what that transition is kind of like to jump into leading a company. So Demetri, maybe go back to you if you want to say a little bit more about it, how you decided that you did want to do it. You're still here 4 years later. What have you really enjoyed about it, and what might be frustrating about it, being the leader of the company?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think, the best way to do it is you have two people. One person's a CEO, one person's a CSO. That's just like the cleanest structure. That's not our structure, so I can talk about the more difficult option. So basically, if you have one person, they have to be the CEO, unless you can find someone else that can do the fundraising. And so I think there's definitely this wave now of like founder-led biotechs where you're the scientist in the lab, you spin it out, and then you run it. But like 15 years ago, that wasn't even a thing. You had to find like a seasoned biotech CEO, and then you were going to be the CSO. So it totally depends on funding, like how hot that, if it's a Nature Medicine paper, maybe you can just find a CEO, and like there's many ways to kind of go about that. But in our case, like, we were working to publish at the same time, and I think like now we published a paper like last week that was for my graduate research work. So like it was a little bit delayed, so we didn't really have that like splash to kind of get it moving. So I think the way we structured it was like, okay, we have one person, they'll be the CEO, and then everybody else that's part-time, I think this is really important, needs to be an advisor. Because if any VC sees the cap table and like an academic founder has 50% of the company, like most VCs won't touch it. So it's the cap table, and who's involved has to be forward-facing, like who's going to contribute going forward, and there has to be vesting to make sure that those people have an incentive to stay, involved. And so I think, if you have two people, that's how I would split it. But in our case, we just went with one CEO, and then we hired scientists and other people to bring in the scientific expertise. And then I had to learn how to pitch and fundraise the hard way.
Yeah, I would kind of second that. I think maybe the most important thing in sort of the exodus from lab is just like learning to not think like a scientist. And at the end of the day, like we're building businesses, right, that have to be profitable and scalable and have an exit. So I think that notion of, this was actually a funny line, right? I'd go around sort of pitching, and I was like, oh my God, there's so many investors that are interested. And one of my advisors was like, but has anyone wrote you a check yet? And I think your company is not real until you actually have funding, right? And I also think, despite a Nature Medicine publication in George Church's lab, at the end of the day, none of that really matters unless you have a very sound commercialization strategy, right? And you could put unit economics behind it, what your roadmap is, partnerships, right? And I think assembling a team, right, that could help you in that process is truly, truly invaluable.
I definitely agree with all of those. I'm just going to say it in different words. If you're thinking of starting a company, like doing a PhD is definitely not a prerequisite. Like it kind of makes things very difficult. Especially, I think we all are, scientists, and they're like investor discussions. Like as a scientist CEO, that doesn't really help, like the scientist title. But yeah, so I also had to unlearn a lot of things and get rid of some of my assumptions when I first started, and some of those were very naive, like, oh, everyone's gonna jump on this. This is like too good to pass, and then people start passing, and then you then you ask yourself, well, okay, maybe I should reconsider that assumption. But then you understand that you have to have a great plan on actually how to go from point A to point B. Just the fact that there's really a lot of pressure to go from point A to point B. Doesn't mean that it will all happen naturally. You have to pave the path.
I want to follow up and jump a little bit further into that, and a little bit more tactical into some of the things you just said, right? Of, hey, you have to unlearn a lot of things coming from the academic world with a scientist mindset. I mean, everyone knows what it takes to do good science. There's rigor behind it. You know how to learn, but you don't need to necessarily learn to run a biotech company. And I don't mean that in the way that sounded. You do need to learn a lot of things to build a biotech company, but you need to also take everything that you are learning and apply it in a different way than you do in the academic setting. So just the next question, really tactical. The one piece, the one thing that you struggled the most with unlearning and transitioning your mind away from when you started a company versus academia?
Yeah, I mean, I could just kind of iterate on it. I mean, who cares about the science, right? It's just who are your customers and who's your potential acquisition partner, right? Like, I think those are probably the things you should think about first.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Nobody cares about the science. It's sad, but like I think as a scientist, you spend all these years pitching science, and like now I've had to cut our slide deck. I mean, the pharma still cares. So like when you meet with pharma for acquisition targets, at least in my experience, like they actually want to see the science because they just see through a lot of stuff. But the investors want to know how you're going to make money, and if you can make money up front in any way possible, that's going to be infinitely better for you. It's going to be infinitely better for pitching, like for everybody. So I think how could, like, again, therapeutics companies like us, we can't really do that unless we do partnerships. So like our pitch recently has been focused on our partnering, and we've done a very good job, you know, at a preclinical stage in doing that. But beyond that, you just have to convince them how you're going to make money. Unfortunately, it's just a different story. And if you're good at telling a science story, you can adapt it. But
I guess the one thing I would add to that is I think, you know, intellectual property is still very important and valuable, right? I think just when you're pitching, it's like a given that you have like a competitive advantage with your technology and IP.
yeah, that's a good add.
I might maybe just add that I think when you're a scientist and you're going and giving scientific talks, and when you get a podium talk and then everyone is like, oh wow, this is amazing, congratulations, that really doesn't mean anything about the company, right?
And it's pretty depressing, I feel like.
Yeah. So take all the success that you've ever had, and then, you know, garbage.
The other thing I'll say is I feel like they care about how much if you've had an exit before and have you fundraised successfully. If you've done those two things, then they like you. But if
That's
it's just
materially
science,
more important than good science.
yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and I was thrown off by the title of this talk, which is the Great Exit. We haven't exited yet. Like that's once that happens, we'll be at an advantage, maybe.
You guys are really great because you're kind of teeing up all of my transitions. I want to pause for 1 second, then we're going to go to IP next and kind of talk about the university exit more so than the exit. But I just want to say, like, I've seen so many companies that they weren't started in the right way from a cap table perspective, as was said before. They only focused on the science, right? And you really only get one chance with a lot of these folks to not show them 35 slides of scientific graphs. They're not going to be interested. It's not going to happen. So the amount of folks that I have to say, you really do have to forget about your science. That's like my day job, is convincing folks that they have to forget about that, assume it's good, and move into these other things is really important. And it is really important to set your company up in the right way. That way you are investable later, and we'll probably talk about more on that topic. And I think leveraging resources like Nucleate and other folks out there are really important. It's good that you're all in this room potentially thinking about getting the tactical advice on that. So I just wanted to add that from my perspective. It's really, really important. We cannot iterate that enough to you all. So IP, this is going to be a pretty broad question because I imagine that there's probably a lot of different horror stories. I know I have some that you all can tell in terms of navigating the university. Like, what should folks be thinking about as they're looking at that next stage of, okay, I know who I want to be in the company. I know that I have something worth it. How do I actually get it out of the university? That can be IP, licensing, all of that.
I guess I will say, listen, I'm a New Yorker, like true and true. I grew up in Greenwich Village, played basketball at St. John's, got a PhD at NYU. I went to Boston for my postdoc, and like, nobody wants to stay in Boston, but what I will say is I think they actually do it right in terms of being pro-entrepreneur. And I think, you know, again, coming out of the Wyss Institute and George Church's lab, like, I mean, we had like 15 labs incubated, 15 companies incubating in his lab. So it's essentially assembly line, and I think tech transfer was more like partners for you. And I've heard kind of horror stories about New York, tech transfer offers. So I think at the end of the day, you want to be a collaborator with sort of your academic institution. I think it depends upon what stage like your IP is at. Like, is it provisional? Is it issued? Like, how defensible is it? Right? And I think going back to having a strong commercial plan, right? If you could really show traction in terms of I have investors, I have commercial partners, and here's my go-to-market strategy, then I think you have more leverage. Because at the end of the day, I think each university wants to see their technology out in the real world and be successful. So I guess my advice would be just operate from a position of leverage, like know your shit, and then treat tech transfer more as like long-term partners that want to see you be successful.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add to that. I think just it depends on the school, obviously. Like our school, Stanford, is also very good at this. Like they encourage spin-outs, and but I would talk. The best thing I'll add is just talk to other founders who've worked with that university, because they'll know what the terms are. And I know it's a lot. Well, I don't know if it's sometimes it's confidential, sometimes it isn't. Like depends on what stage they do the CDA. So
yeah, definitely talk to founders who've done it at your institution before. I'm from Colombia, and Colombia's supportive of startups. I didn't mean it in a bad way. It's just a conversation that you have with your tech transfer agency, tech transfer office, and I do agree that you need to be in a position of power to have that conversation, because early on you're very, very vulnerable. You don't have anything else other than your enthusiasm, and they see it. So when you go in and you're like describing all the things that you're going to do, and they ask themselves the question, why should we give it to you, rather than maybe a large company who's going to take the same IP and are going to be much more capable at it than you are. So you have to have that perspective. You have to also convince yourself that you're the better person for the job.
I'm glad everyone's having great experiences. We can talk more about horror stories later. I think that's still really practical advice. So it also came up earlier, right? Talking to customers, talking to external folks. A lot of times scientists, even when they want to start a company, default to academic conferences, talking to other scientists, kind of getting that buy-in, getting those positive affirmations. But what I really want to ask you all here, just knowing that that's not necessarily what really makes a company successful, who in your journey, doesn't really matter in no specific category, like was the one person that you talked to, that you met, that changed the way you looked at the company and or sort of the journey of spinning out the company?
For me, it was actually the first person to write us a check. And that it can be that way because I think unless people have their have something at stake, they're not really compelled to tell you the truth. But I had this person that said, Aykut, I'm going to invest in you, but we're going to have to sit down and we're going to have to work together for sometimes long hours to make sure you understand what you need to do. And that was very, very powerful to me. And that's, I think, when we built our strategy for real.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad I went second to have a little time to think about it, because there's a lot of advice you get, I think, all day long. In some ways I'm getting advice. But I think one thing that stood out to me recently that helped was from Techstars. So Techstars is like an accelerator program in the city. And they basically advised us to they basically said two things about fundraising. One was that like momentum is everything. You have to schedule all your meetings at one time, which I guess like, I don't know. I never really thought that would be a problem, but there's just like this, they just knew more about fundraising than I did, and a lot, and it really helped to just have like a structured process where you say like you book 40 meetings in a week, and like you tell everybody that this is the time that you're going to be fundraising, and you start the meeting scheduling and all that beforehand. And yeah, I mean, it just, the first time I raised versus the second time I raised was totally different, and I think that a lot of it was because of that. And I think it seems like a simple piece of advice, but it just really helped our company. So that's the one recently that I'm thinking about, kind of trajectory-wise, that changed a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I definitely think the person who writes you your first check, right, is super duper important. I do think at every step of the way you're learning, like at every stage, you're like, yo, am I crazy? And like, okay, I'm not crazy. All right, this person believes in it, this and that. But speaking of belief, I actually think maybe the first person you find that could be like a co-founder that is willing to like go all in with you, like I think that really changes everything, because then you're not in it alone. Someone else kind of believes in this idea, and now you're actually building a real team. And I just think team is probably one of the most important things for any successful venture.
So we're hearing glimpses of this come through, but I still think this question is worth asking specifically. We know that science is not as important in this part of the journey, right? There's still a big difference between the academic proof that you leave with and then the commercial proof that you have to build, right? And I think the reason I want to ask this question still is because I think you all have slightly different technologies, and there's a difference in the gap that you had from the scientific and academic proof to commercial proof. So I'd be curious to hear about what you felt like the biggest gaps were and how you potentially filled them. And Jonathan, maybe we'll start with you, because I know you have sort of the consumer side of things as well, which is a whole different angle on this.
Yeah, I think specifically for us, right, when you're dealing with novel, sort of microorganisms, I think one of the biggest bottlenecks is just sort of like supply chain and sort of industrial fermentation, especially of strict anaerobes. So I think for us, it was finding like a strategic partner and be able to go from like lab scale batch fermentation to like thousands of liters to produce hundreds of kilograms of lyophilized sort of food grade material. And then we actually knew, right, we could go from a research lab to an actual commercial product with profitable unit economics. And then from there, be able to leverage that commercial product to actually go into clinical trials and sort of like actual sales and commercialization. So I think that's part of the de-risking journey, going from like a lab discovery to something that is industrially scalable.
Yeah, I think like my short answer to that would just be that, like, okay, so we're a therapeutics company, so like our only way to make money before, I mean, there's really three ways. You can raise money from VCs, you can take in grants, or you can partner with pharma companies. Like there isn't really a lot of other ways to make money. So we had this platform technology that allowed us to make delivery vehicles for kidney. That's what we used it for. And then we realized like, okay, like although our internal pipeline, the drugs we want to make therapeutically are kidney, like that's not going to make money for a long time. So we either have to raise endless amounts of money or we figure out another way to, capitalize the thing. So we realized like, okay, why don't we just make delivery vehicles and license those to pharma companies through these like starting with research collaborations and converting those to licensing deals. So we really tried to leverage our platform. So if you have a similar technology that can be used in a lot of different ways, again, you have to do customer discovery and all that to figure out that like people will actually pay for the platform, because then you invest a lot of time into it and no one's going to pay. So that's a trick that we had to sort of figure out. But once we realized like that upfront money from the platform deals could then help our internal pipeline, that really changed the switch for us.
That's really cool to hear, guys. So we heard about the financial gap, and we heard about the manufacturing gap, and I'm going to talk about different gaps. So for us, what we really needed to understand was how to go from, okay, cool science project to convincing people that, clinicians are going to use it. So there's a gap there, and that is, cool science to actually life-changing medical device. You have to bridge. You have to. It's storytelling. It's showing how your device, your technology works, and it's actually convincing people that this is valuable enough to try out, to test, and also convince every single stakeholder. There are gaps between your value proposition and every single stakeholder that you're going to have to convince. So for us, it's convince clinicians to use it, convince patients to request it, convince hospital systems to have your device stocked and things like that. So closing all those gaps, it's a lot of work, but when you have something that is worthwhile, it'll happen.
The different company types really lend themselves to an explanation of the different types of gaps, and I think it's good for everyone to see. You're going to face many of these gaps. You'll probably face overlapping gaps in many different areas over time, and you kind of have to figure it out. That's what you do as founders. I want to transition now into the back half of the title, right? Funded ventures, and starting to think about fundraising. And I know this is sort of company dependent and everyone's journey is different, but I want to just start, right, going back to the science a little bit actually, and kind of knowing that stopping point, if you'll call it that, of like when do you have the right commercially thoughtful data or that milestone hit to then know I should really start fundraising, I can really take this to the next level and build the company from where it is today?
So like our experience was actually, it's a lot of it is more practical than anything else. So like we had some grants in academia that were expiring at a certain time, and then we had like a translational research grant that came off the R01 grant, but that expired at a certain point. And so like we could continue applying for R01s or try to renew this translational grant, but like the idea after this translational grant was that we would launch the company. And so like for my experience, it was just practical. I mean, there is like certain things like in therapeutics you want to have in vivo proof of concept. So like what I tell people is like you kind of want to have, you don't want to stay in academia too long, but you also don't want to leave too fast, because there's a lot of resources in academia, like the mouse facility, for example, we learned the hard way, that's there and you can take advantage of. And it's like there's a lot of stuff by being a student that's actually, or a postdoc, that's beneficial. So my general advice was to stay as long as you can, that makes sense. But then when it starts to slow things down or you need to hire external people, that's when you need to get your own space and spin out.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think staying in academia, right, and sort of leveraging it as kind of like an incubator, an accelerator, is probably a great thing to do. For me, I guess we're not a therapeutic company, right, and or at least not yet. And for better or worse, I've been heavily influenced by the book, The Lean Startup. And the whole principle is, don't over-engineer, right? Just sort of get a minimum viable product to market as soon as you can, to learn, then iterate, then optimize. And I also think on our journey, again, trying to raise money from biotech VCs when you're a non-therapeutic company is challenging. So I think finding creative ways to commercialize something, generate revenue, learn, iterate, and sort of scale upon that, so you could be as self-sufficient as soon as possible, right? I think that is the name of the game for FitBiomics, right? And it's very different from most biotech companies. It's not something I would necessarily advise. I think stay in academia and raise as a therapeutic, right, company as much as you can. But I think for me, it's always been about how do we get something to market? Don't over-engineer it. Learn as soon as you can and sort of let those insights guide where to go next.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Being a medical device company very closely tied to therapeutics is difficult. It's better to just be a therapeutics company. But you're dealt the hand you're dealt. So I think the important thing is you make use of the resources that are available to you, and if that's in academia, great, you make use of them while they're available. For us, for example, we went through something similar. We made use of R01 grants while in academia, and then by the time it was time for things to start spinning out, we made use of the small business program, and that has been helpful for Haystack.
The last thing I'll say too is that they own the IP anyways, so like it's in your interest to use their resources if they're going to own it. If it's not, then it could be a different story.
One last question that I want to ask is, let's say you have achieved the end goal of raising money, whether that's grants, venture, whatever it is. You're out of the university and you're operating. What do you see from that point as the biggest challenge, right? You've done the hard thing. You've raised the money. But the hard work doesn't always stop there, right? So what have been some of the challenges from that point of things, or that you anticipate being challenges from that side of things?
I'd just say mental health, maybe. Actually, I wanted to say this. I think we should normalize that this process, you're going to see a lot of failure, right? Like, I think that you just have to accept that's normal. Right? And I think at the end of the day, the biggest thing is just like your belief and your passion, right? If you believe in this, right, you're going to find a way through it. And I think going back to having a team, right, and a set of investors that have a unified vision, right, and a core belief and passion, I think that will get you through a lot of these things.
Yeah, I think I don't know what the statistics are on this, but I remember read it people post it on LinkedIn a lot. Is what's the percentage of startups that die for different reasons? And I think the reasons would surprise you. I think one of the biggest reasons is actually co-founder disputes. Another big reason is just actually losing motivation, if that's a category, just they don't want to work on it anymore. And then the reasons you would think running out of money, not being able to raise, are not the reasons that companies fail in the overwhelming majority. And I think sometimes that helps me just kind of put things in perspective, because even when you're struggling, knowing that is oh, well, it's actually about managing the team and making sure that the team runs smoothly. I think the things to think about if you're starting your own company is just am I in a place personally in my life that I can do this, where I'm going to take, it's going to be 5 to 10 years of your life dedicated to this, struggling and the ups and the downs. Is this a project I want to work on for that long? Because, then you're sort of, if you're not willing to, it's not going to be something that, I'm going to get a quick exit and make money. That's just not how most startups go. And a lot of, there are exceptions, but I think it's you have to want to do it more than anything else. And this is the problem I want to work on. And I think that's kind of how you set yourself up as for success.
Yeah, you just hope for the quick exit. I think I will agree with everything. But I'll add maybe people is a very important part of it. You're not going to hopefully spend 5 to 10 years of your life working on it alone, but with who you've selected to work with. The people that you surround yourself with is incredibly, incredibly important. Who your co-founders are, who your first hires are going to be. That you could easily lose valuable mental health over the wrong people. So very important, maybe much more important than anything else we've talked about.
So we're going to do a quick rapid fire round. These are always fun. One thing you wish someone told you before founding your company.
It's going to be very, very, very difficult.
Same thing, but I think pick a problem you really personally care about.
I wish someone told me it would be easy. No, stay super focused.
Well, lucky for you all, you've been told it's going to be very, very difficult early on, right? The one slide in your pitch deck you constantly got wrong early on.
Market size.
The whole thing.
Yeah, well.
I just had way too much science.
I agree with that sentiment, but de-emphasizing the commercialization strategy.
How many total slides for an early pitch deck?
6.
I'd say 15 maximum, but make sure the most important slides are in the first 4, because people won't read after that.
Yeah, I'd say 6 to 15.
And a sort of off-the-cuff question, how many of those should be science?
3.
Yeah, 1 in.
Okay, I like 3.
There's an appendix for a reason. One person academic founders should talk to much earlier than they usually do.
Corporate lawyer? Yeah.
That's a good one.
I was going to say other founders who successfully raised in your field recently.
I agree. Just to be different, I would say customers.
Last one, then I'll let you guys off the hook. One word to describe the transition from academia to a startup.
Life.
I would say inspiring. Be a little optimistic.
2 words, blissful ignorance.
Thank you all for the insights. Any questions from the audience?
I was just, one question was around, you kind of alluded to it, but it was a little unclear to me, that as an investor, if I come in and I want to partner with you, you don't actually own it until you've gone to tech transfers or at Columbia or Stanford and said, hey, I want to spin this out. Can you just unpack that a little bit? At what point do you own anything so you can actually go do a deal? And typically I've seen it's 5 to 10% that the university will keep, but any just broad parameters on what the norms are?
Yeah, so I think they're each different tech transfer offices. So I can talk, at Stanford, the way they do it is you can get an option to the IP, which is a $5,000 payment. Or it might be different now. This was in 2019, but there's a not so large payment to basically reserve the right to, have the IP. It's not a license; it's an option to license, and that gives you 6, and you can extend it, but 6 months exclusivity period. They can't license to anyone else, and that's cheap for them, right? It's just taking it off the market for 6 months, which can be bad for them if some big company came in and wanted to buy it. But then basically, that's sort of what you need to start the VC conversation seriously, because you're right. If a VC really, if it's a super hot, CRISPR, for example, you invented CRISPR and a VC wants to fund $100 million of their own money at their own company, they could do that, right? So and again, tech transfer offices work differently in those transformative technologies than a lot of kind of application-based stuff. But in general, you take an option, you start a a C corporation to basically assign the option to the company, and then you go to pitch to VCs. That's in my experience how it worked.
Yeah, I'm just a big believer in less is more. I mean, it's kind of like academic presentations. You don't want to put everything on a slide and a PowerPoint, right? You want to strategically leave things out so people ask you the questions you want to answer. And again, just like with the science, anytime you're fundraising, it's an assumption you're going to license the technology, right? So I would not at all wait till it's official to start pitching, right? Because it'll give you more leverage. And again, if you worked on it and you build a relationship, it's going to happen, right? So I would just full steam ahead.
Yeah, you get the option first. You get some rights to it.
I just want to add one nuance. Like you're rarely going to own the patent. It's all going to be licensed to you through it. And I think that most of the VCs that you'd be talking to, the universities that you're working with, they're going to understand the process, and they're going to understand and push you, hopefully help you start it before you might have a fully negotiated license. What I've seen is that sometimes they want you to get more interest and attention, and they can jack up some of the prices and the licenses. Again, horror stories. But we've got good universities we've worked with up here, and I think that they're your partner overall.
When you talk about your competitors, how do you tell your story? How do you differentiate from others?
Yeah, well, I think it's quite standard to like have a chart there that shows you check all the boxes and none of your competitors do.
Yeah, I think there's the biggest flaw is saying you have no competitors. I think a lot of people do that, but there's always somebody who could be a competitor. And so I think for us, like we try to break it down based on type of competitor. So like for us, there's, kidney, like in our indication competitors, other drugs on the market or in development. Then within kidney gene therapy, there are a list of competitors. And then there's like platform competitors of like who could make delivery vehicles for X tissue, right? So like that's how we structure it to really get into and like in the, pitch deck, there might be one of those three you show depending on the investor, but have those ready in the appendix. So if they ask and they want to do diligence, they know that who else is out there. It's more awareness of the competitive landscape is more important that they know than saying you have none. So that's why none is bad.
Yeah, I'd also just say this is probably a case in which IP and technology is relevant, right? Because if you do have something that is truly unique and defensible, right, that's a competitive advantage. And I think this is, I wouldn't say you talk about the science, but talk about it in terms of like product, right? This is the unicity of our product, its mechanism, its functional applications. These are the target indications, the different sort of consumer demographics. And the one thing I would say is just be careful who you associate yourself with, right? Like, I don't think you want to say, in our case, right, Harvard spin out novel microbes from elite athlete microbiomes. I don't think our competitive landscape is generic probiotics, right? Because I think that devalues, right, our company. So I would think about who you want to be associated with and then sort of explain why you're better.
This one is mostly for Aykut, but everybody else can also weigh in. Because, you both come from institutions and cultures that are a little more entrepreneurship forward. Aykut, you mentioned you were the first to ever do it in your lab.
Yeah.
What was that conversation like with your PI and the other folks kind of around you when you arrived at the realization, like, hey, we got to get this out of the lab. We have to go down the commercial path.
Yeah, I had to do a lot of convincing. I mean, we just sat down and had a really candid talk. I think it's really helpful if you have a good relationship with your advisors and others. Stakeholder, our IP, tech transfer liaison, everyone who's involved. So for us, it just came down to, making a good argument for why we should do it and why now and why me.
So I have a question regarding regulatory compliance. How do you go through, or do you have any workflow or any reference from where you get CLIA or might be US FDA or HIPAA or any kind of compliance or any extra compliance?
Yeah, I think maybe a lot of actually what we are talking about here is actually doing your homework so that, one, and then you'll have done your homework, and then you'll be able to impress people. What it comes down to is you talk to the right people, and they'll tell you, okay, this is your regulatory pathway. For drugs, it's very different from how it is with devices, and that's very different from Jonathan. So your regulatory regulatory pathway could look very, very different based on your technology, your amount of preclinical data, and how dire the need is.
Yeah, I would just add to that, that's kind of part of your commercialization roadmap, right? And again, focusing less on the science and how you actually translate your IP to market. I also think it's part of hiring your team, right? Like in our case, it's a 24-month sort of self-GRAS affirmation regulatory process to get a commercial microbe to market, right? And that's toxicology studies. It's fairly rigorous. But rather than trying to do that myself, I just hired a consultant that's done it numerous times before, right? So it was almost like turnkey. And again, if you have resources, I would sort of leverage that to accelerate that process.
Yeah, I think it's just important to have an understanding of how your regulatory process works. And I think investors, like on therapeutic side, they ask a lot when probably medical device, if you're raising for medical device investors, they want to know everything about. They want to know what your phase 1 trial design is. They want to know your phase 2. They want to know like a lot more detail than I think I like let on. I'm like, we're raising a seed round. Like, why do you need to know like how many patients are going to be in our phase 3? But they just want to see that you've like, they know that stuff will change, but it's like, they want to know that you've kind of thought through, the steps that are needed for regulatory approval.
Is there any references, like the consulting company or a name where I can find it?
There's a lot. So in my experience, at least in gene therapy, there's a ton of different consultants out there, and it's like hiring anyone else. You have to like run a process, interview a bunch of people, and figure out who you work well with, who bills at rates that you can afford. Like it's a pretty difficult process. Like we got intros to like a one-off consultant, but it took us some time to find the one to work with.
I was going to say, back in my day when I was in grad school, we still Googled everything. I don't think people do that anymore, but I would definitely leverage like chat and sort of Claude. The other thing is just, I think we found our regulatory sort of partner through just going to industry conferences and meeting people in the field, what they've done, and just talking to a lot of people.
I just had a quick question for you guys. A lot of the things that you guys have talked about, especially during your pitching, is the science is not necessarily the biggest part of like what makes you unique as competitors. So my question for you is, like, what do you think investors actually care about, right? So you guys come from academia, but there's also a lot of people outside of academia who want to step into this space. And how do you differentiate yourselves and prove to investors that you guys are actually doing like real science and not just like selling snake oil at the end of the day? So how do you like balance between, being true to your science and getting those checks?
Yeah, I think, the hard answer is like right now, if you just look at numbers, like they are investing, well, not, I guess if AI is snake oil, that's what they're investing in. So like so it's hard because you have to find the group of investors who wants to invest in biotech because it is a difficult space to invest in, or at least recently it's been somewhat difficult. So I think you have to get in the room with the right person and then tell the story the way that they're, so you kind of just have to understand a little bit about where they're coming from. But in terms of, I think the second part of your question is like, how do you decide like, I like my company, I want to do this, but like they'll fund this, and that sort of happened to us. Like I think you just have to, unfortunately, like, that's sort of what market discovery is. Like I think you do need to follow, how you can make money, and then if you have a lot of money, then you can reinvest it into other things, right? At least that's been our experience. Like, but yeah, they might have other perspectives.
No, I agree. I think early stage investors, right, high net worth individuals, like family offices, more times than not, they're going to invest in you, right, as a person. Do they like you? Do they believe in you? Are they inspired by your vision? Do they want to go along for the journey? And I think, as was pointed out, do you seem sane, and are you going to work hard, and do you have a reasonable sort of like commercialization and translation strategy? Yeah, I would just say after those early stage investors, how are you going to get a return on investment, right? Like, what is your exit strategy? How are you going to get there? What are the milestones, right? I think at the end of the day, it's a business, and I think thinking about this in terms of that. By the way, I'll just say this. Building sort of a next-gen health company that could have a transformative impact on society as we know it is not mutually exclusive to building a profitable enterprise, right? So I don't, in the words of my dad, like we shouldn't make false choices, right?
Yeah, and I just want to add that science is still important. You just don't need to talk about it as much as you want to, as coming from academia. Because everyone, like when you go talk to investors, the assumption is that you have groundbreaking technology, groundbreaking science. Like that's why you're there. And especially with the scientific background, the question is, do you have all the other pieces? And they are equally important. So that's why we're downplaying the science part.
I think you mentioned like getting a corporate lawyer, but in terms of the IP side, how early were you talking to your IP lawyers, and how much would you say it costs after the provisional, like getting everything converted over time? And then how do you find someone who's really feels good, feels right, and doesn't, feel like they're just trying to get involved because they think it's interesting, like someone who actually wants to dive in, understand the technology, understand the drug or whatever you're putting out, and how to convert it properly and protect it properly?
Yeah, I'll go first. Our technology originated at the university, so it's university IP. We still work with the IP lawyers through our university. And then for our own filings, we just work through references. Whoever someone I trusts. That's how we went through with that.
Yeah, so we have a little bit different situation where, like, when you ask about IP lawyers, a lot of people are like, "Who's your law firm?" Like, we actually have an internal person that he does this for a couple different companies, and so he has equity in the company. We brought him on a chief business officer, so he has a much bigger role than just. And I think the reasoning for that was that you can go to these big law firms, but they charge kind of exorbitant fees, and so we started with a lot of them. We had good experiences, but we just couldn't afford it at some point, or we wanted to file more patents, and so for us, we sort of again ran a similar process like the regulatory consultants. It's like a IP consultant, but they're actually doing your patents, and then you can kind of get a sense they're taking some risk, they're discounting fees, whatever it is. Some law firms big law firms will do deferrals, and we've had good experience with that as well. But what happened at one of our big law firms, we really liked the people we were working with, and then they went to a different firm, and then I'm either going to switch to a different firm or so that's been our experience with IP just in general. And then but the other last thing I'll say is the university will make you, at least at Stanford, the way they do it is they make you pay, after you take the license, they make you pay all their patent costs. So that's something to keep an eye for, that, and those costs can be expensive, especially if you're doing patent filing across the world, after there's a provisional PCT, and then after the PCT, you're going to want to make sure that your fundraising comes in to support that, because that was something that we kind of struggled with early on, that the costs just go up a lot quickly.
Yeah, I agree. Lawyers are very, very expensive. So I think knowing what you want to get out of them, right, and sort of communicating mostly via email and less sort of actual conversations is probably a good idea. In our case, we have two sort of councils. We have a general counsel, which is ORIC, and that's mostly they have supported incorporation, sort of agreements, licensing with Harvard. And then we have an IP council, which is Cooley, and I think we selected them because they have experience in the microbiome space. So I think also looking at companies that are similar in your space or founders and seeing who they use, right, and what their IP is, I think is a good indication who you might want to talk to.
I just have a quick personal journey question. When did you realize you can do this? Or when did you have the interest in doing a startup? Or maybe you got pointed by someone? Or how did you prepare yourself? How do you believe yourself that you can do it? Because it's not something, it's probably going to be new for PhD student, or maybe you just prepared for a decade ago. I'm just curious about your a personal experience.
I don't know any of you, but I think it's not, like I said before, it comes down to do you have the drive to go after it, right? I think that's the bigger bottleneck. And so if you're asking yourself, should I do a startup? The answer is yes. The question becomes, are you personally in a place that you can, allocate the time and the stress, and do you want to go through that, right? But I think the decision of, can I start a company? It's should I or do I want to is really the question I would ask, not can I, or not am I able to, because I think everybody's able to.
Yeah, I agree with those sentiments. I also think it's just extremely important to have a support network. So that could be colleagues, that could be fellow co-founders. I never really wanted to start a company, but kind of my colleagues and my parents and my family talked me into it. And I think even on this journey, right, I'm a poor, struggling entrepreneur, but my fiance hasn't left me, right? So she still supports me. So I think having people in your support network that believe in you and enable you to sort of follow your passions is really, really critical.
Yeah, and I will maybe add that, can you find the motivation to keep going, despite a lack of people validating you all the time, and just having the grit. Can you motivate yourself, and do you have the support mechanism that will keep you sane?
The last thing I would say too is if you're deciding between two things and one of them is a startup and one is something else, I would do the other thing.
All right, well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the panelists. We'll be around to talk.